This is a true story. In the hills of Tuscany, where vineyards cascade down ancient slopes and the scent of cypress hangs heavy in the evening air, there exists a darkness that no amount of Italian sunlight has ever been able to chase away. Between 1968 and 1985, 16 young souls vanished into the night, taken by a phantom who moved through the shadows like smoke through an open window. Couples seeking stolen moments of privacy in the countryside surrounding Florence found instead a terror beyond imagination. And after nearly 4 decades, after wrongful convictions and overturned verdicts, after conspiracy theories and institutional failures that would shame any nation, the identity of the one responsible remains unknown. This is the story of the monster of Florence. Before we begin this journey into one of Europe's most haunting unsolved cases, I want to share something with you. This channel, The Midnight File, is a labor of love. We're on our way to 100 subscribers, and every single one of you who joins us makes it possible to keep telling these stories. So if you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe and hit that like button. We're hoping for 50 likes on this video, and your support means the world. Now, let us begin. I want you to imagine something. Picture yourself on a warm August evening in 1968. The sun has just set over the Florentine hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet. Somewhere in the commune of Signa, just outside Florence, a white Fiat 850 sits parked in a quiet clearing. Inside are Antonio Lobianco, 29 years old, and Barbara Locci, 32, a married woman whose husband works the night shift. In the back seat, curled up and half asleep, is Barbara's 6-year-old son, Natalino. What happens next will set into motion 17 years of terror, 17 years of investigation, and a mystery that to this day refuses to yield its secrets. Before we dive deeper, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop a comment below and tell me what corner of the world this story has reached. Whether you're in Rome or Tokyo, London or Sao Paulo, your presence here matters. Now let me take you back to that August night. The summer of 1968 was a time of change across the world. Students were protesting in Paris. Soviet tanks were rolling into Prague. In America, the counterculture was in full bloom. But in the quiet villages surrounding Florence, life moved at a slower pace, governed by tradition, by family, by the rhythms of agriculture that had defined this region for centuries. Antonio Lobianco was a bricklayer, a working man with calloused hands and simple dreams. Barbara Locci was what the Italians of that era would have called a woman of loose morals, though such judgments seem cruel in retrospect. She was unhappily married to Stefano Mele, a man who worked nights and who knew, as everyone in their small community knew, that his wife sought comfort elsewhere. Antonio was not her only lover. There had been others, including men from Sardinia, immigrants who had come to Tuscany seeking work and who found in Barbara's company something more. On the night of August 21st, Barbara had taken young Natalino and met Antonio at a local cinema. They watched a film together, an ordinary evening, unremarkable in every way. Afterward, they drove to a secluded spot near the cemetery of Signa, a place known to locals as a lover's lane, where couples could find privacy away from prying eyes. What Natalino witnessed that night would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was sleeping, or trying to sleep, when the gunshots shattered the stillness. The boy later described seeing a figure approach the car, a shadow darker than the surrounding night. The figure raised something. There were flashes of light, and then Antonio slumped forward. Barbara tried to flee, scrambling out of the passenger door, but she didn't get far. More shots rang out and she fell. The boy, terrified beyond comprehension, remained frozen in the back seat. The figure, whoever it was, apparently either didn't see the child or chose to spare him. When the phantom melted back into the darkness, Natalino waited. Minutes passed, perhaps hours. Eventually, the 6-year-old gathered his courage and walked several kilometers through the night to the nearest house, where he woke a family and told them what had happened. The investigation that followed was swift and, by all appearances, conclusive. Stefano Mele, the cuckolded husband, was arrested within days. His motive was clear: jealousy. His opportunity was undeniable. He had no alibi for that night. And under interrogation, Mele confessed. He named accomplices, other lovers of his wife, Sardinian immigrants Francesco and Salvatore Vinci. But the confessions were contradictory, confused, and ultimately only Mele was convicted. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison, and the case was closed, or so everyone believed. If this story ended here, it would be a tragedy, certainly, but a comprehensible one. A crime of passion, a husband pushed beyond his limits, a family destroyed by infidelity and violence. But this story doesn't end here. It was only beginning. 6 years passed. Stefano Mele sat in his prison cell. Life in Tuscany continued its ancient rhythms. And then, on the night of September 14th, 1974, the nightmare returned. Pasquale Gentilcore was 19 years old. Stefania Pettini was 18. They were young in love, and that Saturday night they had driven Pasquale's father's Fiat 127 to a secluded area near Borgo San Lorenzo, about 20 miles north of Florence. They parked near a vineyard, seeking the same privacy that countless young couples had sought before them. Sometime after midnight, a figure emerged from the darkness. The attack was swift and brutal. Pasquale was shot multiple times through the car window before he could even react. Stefania managed to exit the vehicle, perhaps hoping to flee, but she was caught almost immediately. She was stabbed, her body violated in ways that I will not describe in detail out of respect both for her memory and for the content policies that govern this platform. What I can tell you is this: the nature of the wounds suggested not mere rage, but something far more disturbing, something ritualistic, something that spoke of deep psychological pathology. When investigators arrived at the scene the next morning, they found Stefania's body positioned deliberately, arranged in a manner that suggested the perpetrator had taken his time, had lingered over his work. And in her flesh, they found bullets from a .22 caliber weapon. Here is where the story takes its most chilling turn. When ballistics experts examined those bullets and compared them to the records from the 1968 case, they made a discovery that should have shaken the Italian justice system to its core. The bullets were a match, not just the same caliber, but the same weapon. The same gun that had ended the lives of Antonio Lobianco and Barbara Locci had been used again 6 years later, while Stefano Mele sat behind bars. Think about what this means. Either Mele was innocent all along, wrongfully convicted while the true perpetrator remained free, or there was more than one person involved, and whoever held that gun in 1968 still held it in 1974. Either way, the official narrative had crumbled. The case that was supposed to be closed had just blown wide open. But here is where institutional failure begins its slow, corrosive work. Rather than immediately re-examining the Mele conviction, rather than acknowledging that a dangerous predator was hunting in the Tuscan hills, authorities seemed almost reluctant to connect the cases. The implications were too damaging, too embarrassing. To admit the connection would be to admit that an innocent man may have been imprisoned, that a true threat had been allowed to roam free, that the system had failed catastrophically. And so, incredibly, life went on. The connection between the cases was noted, but not acted upon with the urgency it demanded, and the shadow continued to wait. If you're finding value in this deep dive into one of history's most perplexing cases, please consider sharing this video with someone who appreciates true crime storytelling. Your shares help us grow, and growth means more stories like this one. Now let us continue. The next 6 years brought more tragedy, more terror, and more investigative confusion. On June 6, 1981, Giovanni Foggi, 30 years old, and Carmela Denuccio, 21, were attacked in their car near Scandici, just southwest of Florence. The pattern was unmistakable now. Saturday night. A secluded location, a young couple. Gunshots from that same .22 caliber Beretta, and afterward, the ritualistic mutilation of the female victim. By this point, the press had given the perpetrator a name: Il Mostro di Firenze, the monster of Florence. The term was coined by journalist Mario Spezzi, a crime reporter who would become obsessed with the case and whose involvement would eventually lead to his own arrest. A twist we'll explore later. But for now, the name captured something essential about the fear that was spreading through Tuscany. This was not merely a criminal, This was something monstrous, something that seemed to exist outside normal human comprehension. The summer of 1981 brought another attack. On October 22nd, Stefano Baldi and Susanna Cambi, both 24 years old, were found in their Volkswagen Golf near Calenzano. The same weapon, the same pattern, the same aftermath. By now, the people of Florence were terrified. Young couples abandoned the countryside, seeking privacy elsewhere or not at all. Parents who once would have forbidden their children from entertaining romantic partners at home began to reconsider. Better their sons and daughters find intimacy under the family roof than risk the fate that had befallen so many in those moonless Tuscan nights. It was a strange social revolution, born of fear, and it spoke to how profoundly the monster had altered the rhythms of life in this ancient region. The investigation, meanwhile, stumbled forward. Authorities focused their attention on what became known as the Sardinian Trail, pursuing Francesco Vinci and his brother Salvatore, the men who had been peripherally connected to the 1968 case. The theory was logical enough. If the same weapon was being used, perhaps the same individuals were involved. Perhaps Stefano Mele had been merely an accomplice, and the true architect of the crimes had been one of the Sardinian immigrants. Francesco Vinci was arrested in 1982. The evidence against him was circumstantial but suggestive. He had known Barbara Locci. He had access to firearms. His character references were not exactly glowing, and for a brief moment it seemed the monster might finally have a face. But the monster, it seemed, had other plans. On September 19, 1983, while Francesco Vinci sat in a prison cell awaiting trial, something terrible happened in the commune of Galluzzo. 2 young people were found shot to death in a Volkswagen Golf, their bodies riddled with bullets from that same cursed Beretta. But this time there was a variation. Both victims were male. Horst Wilhelm Meyer and Jensu Rusch were German university students, traveling through Italy during a gap year. They were friends, sleeping in their car to save money when the shadow found them. The prevailing theory is that the perpetrator, approaching in darkness, mistook one of the young men for a woman, the length of their hair perhaps, or their positions in the vehicle. Whatever the reason, the attack proceeded as it always did, with devastating speed and efficiency. But here is the detail that speaks volumes about the psychology at work. The bodies were not mutilated. Unlike virtually every previous female victim, Meyer and Rusch were left intact. This suggests that the ritualistic elements of the crimes were specifically directed at women, that whatever pathology drove the perpetrator found its expression only in the female form. The male victims were obstacles, threats to be neutralized. The women were something else entirely. Something I hesitate to name because to name it is to give form to darkness. Francesco Vinci was released. Once again, the investigation had reached a dead end. Once again, the monster had demonstrated that he remained at large, mocking the efforts of those who sought to stop him. The year 1984 brought no respite. On July 29th, Claudio Stefanacci and Pia Gilda Rontini were attacked in their car near Vicchio. Pia was just 18 years old, on the cusp of adulthood, her whole life stretching out before her. That life ended in a clearing in the Tuscan hills, ended by bullets and blade, ended by a phantom who disappeared once more into the night. And then came 1985, the year that would mark both the monster's final known crime and the beginning of a new, even more disturbing chapter in the investigation. Jean-Michel Kravitchvili was 25 years old, a French tourist traveling through Italy with his companion, Nadine Moriot, 36. On the night of September 7th, they pitched their tent in a field near San Cassiano Valdipesa, about 10 miles south of Florence. It was a beautiful location, peaceful, removed from the noise of the city. They could not have known that they had chosen to camp in the hunting grounds of a predator who had been claiming victims for 17 years. The attack came sometime after dark. Jean-Michel was shot as he emerged from the tent, perhaps alerted by some sound, perhaps simply rising for a moment. Nadine was found inside, her body bearing the signature wounds that had marked so many victims before her. But this time, the monster did something unprecedented, something that transformed the case from a regional horror into an international sensation. Several days after the bodies were discovered, prosecutors in Florence received a package. Inside was a plain envelope, and inside that envelope was a portion of Nadine Morio's body along with a letter. The contents of that letter have never been fully disclosed, but its message was clear enough. The monster was taunting them. He was demonstrating his power, his invincibility, his contempt for those who hunted him. This was September 1985, and then, as suddenly as the terror had begun, it stopped. No more attacks, no more bodies, no more letters. The monster of Florence, after 17 years and 16 victims, simply vanished. Why did the crimes stop? This question has haunted investigators for decades. Did the perpetrator die? Was he imprisoned for an unrelated offense? Did he move to another region, another country? Did he simply decide, for reasons known only to himself, that his work was complete? The truth is, we don't know. We may never know. But the story was far from over. In many ways, the most bizarre chapter was just beginning. If stories like this haunt you the way they haunt me, consider subscribing to the Midnight File. We explore the cases that refuse to be forgotten, the questions that refuse to be answered. And trust me, the files only get darker from here. Let me take you now into the labyrinth of the investigation that followed, a journey through wrongful convictions, sensational theories, and institutional failures that would be almost comic if the stakes weren't so tragically high. In January 1993, nearly 8 years after the last confirmed attack, Italian authorities arrested a man named Pietro Pacciani. He was 68 years old, a farmer from Mercatale, a small village about 15 miles from Florence. He had a criminal record that read like a catalogue of violence. In 1951, he had been convicted of taking another man's life in a confrontation that also involved the assault of his then-fiancée. He had served time and been released, and now, based on a combination of circumstantial evidence, behavioral profiling, and what prosecutors described as a web of connections to the earlier cases, he stood accused of being the monster of Florence. The trial of Pietro Pacciani became an international sensation. Journalists from across Europe descended on Florence. Among them was Thomas Harris, the American author whose creation, Hannibal Lecter, had become synonymous with fictional depictions of calculated evil. Harris attended the proceedings, researching material for what would become his novel Hannibal, which would be set partly in Florence and would draw directly on the atmosphere of terror that the monster had created. The prosecution painted Pacciani as a man of boundless depravity. They described his history of violence, his supposed collection of weapons, his proximity to the crime scenes. They alleged that books on satanic rituals and black magic had been found in his home, hinting at darker motivations for the crimes. And on November 1st, 1994, the court delivered its verdict. Guilty on 7 counts, Pietro Pacciani was sentenced to life imprisonment, 1 term for each victim in 7 of the 8 confirmed double homicides. For a moment, it seemed that justice had finally been served. The monster had a face, a name, a prison cell. The people of Tuscany could breathe easy at last. But the truth, as it so often does in this case, proved far more complicated. In February 1996, an appeals court overturned Pacciani's conviction. The judges found the evidence insufficient. The prosecution's case built more on inference and supposition than on hard proof. Pacciani was freed, though his liberty would prove short-lived in the cosmic sense. In December of that same year, Italy's Supreme Court took the extraordinary step of annulling the acquittal and ordering a new trial, suggesting that proper procedures had not been followed. Pietro Pacciani would never face that second trial. On February 22, 1998, he was found deceased in his home in Mercatale. The official cause was cardiovascular failure, a heart attack brought on by severe coronary disease. He was discovered lying face down on the floor, alone with no witnesses to his final moments. But even in passing, Pacciani could not escape controversy. Michel Giuttari, the chief inspector, who had taken over the monster investigation, harbored suspicions about the circumstances of Pacciani's demise. Giuttari theorized that someone may have wanted to silence the old farmer permanently to prevent him from revealing accomplices, or more disturbingly, the identities of those who had allegedly commissioned the crimes. An autopsy confirmed natural causes, but the questions lingered. They linger still. And here we enter the most controversial territory of all, the theory of the compagnie di merende, the snack buddies. During Pacciani's original trial, prosecutors had advanced the theory that the monster was not a single individual but a group. The name compagnie di merende, or snack buddies, originated as a term of mockery when one of the alleged associates, Mario Vanni, claimed that he and his friends had merely been enjoying innocent picnics in the Tuscan countryside. The name stuck, though its whimsical quality belied the darkness of the accusations. According to this theory, Pacciani had not acted alone. He had been aided by Mario Vanni, a postman, and Giancarlo Lotti, an odd jobs man with a reputation for being easily influenced. A fourth man, Giovanni Faggi, was also implicated. The prosecution alleged that these men had traveled together to the crime scenes, that they had participated in the attacks, that they had shared in whatever twisted satisfaction the violence provided. In March 1998, following Pacciani's passing, Vanni was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for 4 of the double homicides. Lotti, who had opted for Italy's abbreviated trial process, received 26 years. Faggi was acquitted for lack of evidence. But even these convictions failed to account for all 16 victims. The snack buddies theory explained some of the crimes but not others. And critically, none of the forensic evidence, none of the witness testimony, none of the confessions that had been extracted from these men could definitively link them to the weapon, that .22 caliber Beretta that had been used in every single attack. The gun was never found. And without the gun, the case remained fundamentally unresolved. I want to pause here and acknowledge something. This story involves allegations that strain credulity, theories that venture into territory that might seem more appropriate for fiction than for a serious criminal investigation. But I present them to you because they are part of the historical record, because they influence the official investigation, and because understanding them is essential to understanding how this case became so hopelessly tangled. Michel Giuttari, the inspector who led the investigation through the late 1990s and early 2000s, became convinced that the monster crimes were connected to something far larger than a group of rural misfits seeking perverse thrills. Giuttari developed what became known as the satanic cult theory. According to Giuttari, the crimes were not random acts of violence but commissioned operations. Powerful figures, he alleged, had hired Pacciani and his associates to hunt couples and to harvest female body parts for use in occult rituals. Giuttari pointed to evidence that had been found near crime scenes: stone circles, upside-down crosses, arrangements of roses and other symbols associated with black magic. He noted that Pacciani had apparently come into money that could not be explained through his modest farming income, and he alleged that the trail led upward into the highest echelons of Florentine society, involving elite families, professional networks, and possibly even connections to Freemasonry. Giancarlo Lotti, during his testimony, reportedly spoke of a mysterious doctor who had commissioned the crimes, who had demanded specific body parts, who had paid handsomely for the grisly deliveries. This doctor was never identified, never charged, never conclusively shown to exist. But the allegation fueled years of investigation and speculation. How much of this is true? How much is the product of coerced testimony, institutional desperation, and the human tendency to find patterns in chaos? I cannot say with certainty. What I can tell you is that more credible observers have suggested that the conspiracy theories, whatever their ultimate validity, serve to distract from more prosaic but equally damning failures. The investigation into the monster of Florence was plagued by incompetence at virtually every level. Evidence was mishandled, chain of custody procedures were ignored or violated, crime scenes were contaminated before proper documentation could be completed. In 1982, an examining magistrate discovered bullets and shell casings stored improperly in a folder within an old case file, their provenance impossible to establish. The ballistic reports from the 1968 case described characteristics that differed from the evidence later presented in court, raising questions about whether original materials had been tampered with or replaced. At least 15 individuals allegedly connected to the case perished or disappeared under circumstances that were never adequately explained. before they could provide testimony. Witnesses recanted statements. Suspects died in fires, in car accidents, in prison. The Italian intelligence services, SISDE, were allegedly involved in aspects of the investigation or its suppression, though the nature of their involvement remains unclear. And in 2006, the case claimed another victim, though this time the violence was institutional rather than physical. Mario Spezzi, the journalist who had coined the term "monster of Florence" and who had covered the case for decades, was arrested on charges that included involvement in covering up evidence, criminal association, obstruction of justice, and libel against Inspector Giuttari. Spezzi maintained his innocence, describing the charges as retaliation for his critical reporting on the investigation. He was eventually cleared, but his arrest sent a chilling message. Even those who sought truth in this case could find themselves consumed by it. If you're still with me at this point in our journey, I want to thank you. This is a complex story full of twists and reversals, and your patience in following it speaks to your genuine interest in understanding what happened in those Tuscan hills. If you haven't already, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support makes it possible for us to continue telling stories that deserve to be told. Now let us turn to the question that haunts everyone who studies this case. Who was the monster of Florence? The honest answer is that we don't know, but we can examine what the evidence suggests, what the various theories propose, and what modern forensic techniques might yet reveal. The FBI, asked to provide a behavioral profile in 2007, described a lone offender. Their analysis suggested a sexually inadequate, immature male, likely in his 40s during the peak of the crimes. He probably lived alone or with an elderly relative. He had semi-skilled employment with limited public contact. He may have had military service, given his comfort with firearms. He likely consumed violent material of a certain nature. He would have blended into his community, unremarkable, invisible, the neighbor you passed without a second glance. This profile has its merits. It accounts for the consistency of the crimes, the patience required for the extended stalking that preceded each attack, the clear sexual pathology evident in the mutilations. A single disturbed individual operating alone would explain the unity of method and motive. But there are problems with this theory. The crimes span 17 years and cover a geographic area of hundreds of square miles. The perpetrator never left usable fingerprints, never left identifiable DNA, never made a mistake that led to his capture. This level of forensic awareness, this degree of operational security, seems almost superhuman. It suggests either extraordinary luck, extraordinary skill, or assistance from others. The group theory, advanced by prosecutors and embodied in the Snack Buddies' convictions, has its own logic. Multiple perpetrators would explain how the crimes could continue while various suspects were incarcerated. It would explain the range and frequency of the attacks, and it would align with the testimony, however coerced, of individuals like Giancarlo Lotti. But the group theory fails to account for the remarkable consistency of method. Serial offenders who work in groups typically show variations in technique as different members take different roles or as the group dynamics evolve. The monster crimes show no such variation. The same gun, the same attack pattern, the same ritualistic aftermath. This speaks to a singular vision, a single hand guiding the violence. Modern investigators have proposed a synthesis. Perhaps there was indeed a group, but one member served as the primary actor, the artist of atrocity, while others assisted, watched, or received the products of his work. This would explain both the consistency and the apparent involvement of multiple individuals. It would also align with Giuttari's darker suggestions about commissioned crimes and clients who remained hidden. But all of this remained speculation until 2024, when a discovery emerged that has reopened the entire investigation. Hematologist Lorenzo Iovino, analyzing evidence that had been preserved from the 1985 crime scene, discovered DNA on bullets recovered from that final attack on Jean-Michel Kravitchvili and Nadine Morio. This DNA, found in trace amounts on the brass casings, likely came from the hand of whoever had loaded or handled the weapon, and when compared to DNA from bullets recovered from the 1983 and 1984 crime scenes, it matched. the same person, it appears, handled the ammunition used in at least 3 of the final attacks. This person left biological evidence, microscopic but definitive, that has survived for 4 decades. And here is the revelation that has energized those who still seek justice. This DNA matches none of the convicted individuals. Not Pacciani, not Vanni, not Lotti. The genetic signature belongs to someone else entirely, someone who was never identified, never arrested, never brought to trial. This discovery has prompted the Florence prosecutor's office to authorize new investigative measures. The body of Stefania Pettini, the young woman attacked in 1974, has been exhumed. Investigators believe that biological material may remain beneath her fingernails, preserved for 50 years, evidence of a struggle with her attacker that could finally yield a genetic profile sufficient for identification. There are also anonymous letters, communications received by authorities over the years that have been preserved and that may contain DNA from whoever sent them. These are being analyzed with modern techniques unavailable during the original investigation. Will these efforts succeed? Will the monster of Florence finally have a name, a face, an identity that can be verified and confirmed? I cannot say, but for the first time in decades, there is genuine hope. In October 2025, Netflix released a 4-part documentary series titled The Monster of Florence, bringing renewed international attention to the case. The series presents the facts as they are known, explores the various theories, and interviews those who have spent their lives seeking answers. It has introduced this story to a new generation, to viewers who were not yet born when the crimes were committed, who know nothing of the terror that once gripped Tuscany. Perhaps one of those viewers holds a piece of the puzzle. Perhaps someone knows something they've never shared, a detail that seemed insignificant at the time, but that might now prove crucial. Perhaps the monster himself, if he yet lives, is watching, remembering, weighing whether his secrets will finally be exposed. Attorney Walter Biscotti represents 3 families of victims, including Estelle Lanciotti, daughter of Nadine Morio. In 2022, Biscotti formally requested that prosecutors reopen the investigation. His words bear repeating, "We are looking for the truth with a new investigation, and we're convinced that there are elements in the old case files that were wrongly overlooked." The truth, such a simple word, such an elusive quarry. Now let us speak of the victims themselves, for they are the heart of this story. Not the investigators, not the suspects, not the conspiracy theorists or the journalists or the novelists who have circled this case like moths around a flame. The victims, Antonio Lobianco and Barbara Locci, taken on that August night in 1968, Pasquale Gentilcore and Stefania Pettini, ended in September 1974, Giovanni Foggi and Carmela Denuccio, Stefano Baldi and Susanna Cambi, Paolo Mainardi and Antonella Migliorini, Horst Wilhelm Meyer and Jens Uwe Rusch, young Germans far from home, Claudio Stefanacci and Pia Gilda Rontini, Jean-Michel Cravechvili and Nadine Maurio. 16 lives, 16 futures that will never unfold, 16 families left with unanswered questions and unhealed wounds. These were not statistics, they were people. They had hopes and fears, dreams and disappointments. They laughed and cried and loved. They sought moments of connection in a world that can feel cold and isolating, and they found instead a darkness that swallowed them whole. Barbara Locci's son, Natalino, the boy who witnessed the first attack from the back seat of that Fiat, grew up haunted by what he had seen. His testimony was crucial to the initial investigation, but no child should carry such memories. No child should know what he knew. The families of the French victims, Nadine and Jean-Michel, have spent decades seeking answers across national borders, navigating a foreign legal system in a language they did not speak, pursuing justice in a case that seemed designed to resist resolution. Estelle Lanciotti, Nadine's daughter, was a child when her mother was taken. She is now middle-aged, still waiting, still hoping that she will one day know what happened and why, that she will be able to visit her mother's grave with some measure of closure. These are the stakes of this case. Not intellectual puzzles to be solved, not entertainment to be consumed. Human lives, human suffering, human dignity demanding recognition and justice. If this story has moved you, If you feel even a fraction of the weight that these families have carried for decades, please share this video. Not for us, but for them. For the possibility that awareness might lead to answers. For the faint hope that somewhere, someone knows something. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment. Tell us what you think. Every engagement helps spread these stories further, and you never know who might be listening. Let me tell you about something that has always struck me about this case. It's a detail that might seem minor, but that I believe speaks to something essential. The crimes almost always occurred during new moons. Think about that. The perpetrator planned his attacks to coincide with the darkest nights of the month, when the absence of moonlight provided maximum cover. This is not the behavior of an impulsive individual, driven by urges he cannot control. This is calculation. This is strategy. This is someone who studied the lunar calendar, who scouted locations, who waited with predatory patience for conditions to align. The Saturday night timing also speaks to planning. The weekend meant the victims would be out seeking recreation. It meant slower police response times, reduced staffing, greater likelihood that crimes would not be discovered until morning. The geographic range of the attacks, spanning a 20-mile radius around Florence, suggests either a perpetrator with access to a vehicle and familiarity with the region, or multiple perpetrators who divided the territory among themselves. The consistent use of a single weapon across 17 years indicates that the Beretta was carefully maintained and deliberately retained, even as the risk of keeping such incriminating evidence must have grown with each new investigation. The mutilations, while I've deliberately avoided graphic detail, showed a consistency that suggests ritual purpose rather than rage. Specific areas of the female body were targeted, specific procedures followed. Whether these were for the perpetrator's own satisfaction, or as some have theorized, for delivery to others, the pattern was deliberate. All of this points to someone intelligent, organized, patient, and disciplined, someone who could maintain a double life for nearly 2 decades, committing acts of profound horror while presumably functioning in normal society between crimes. Someone who either worked alone with remarkable skill or who was protected by others with resources and reach. The monster of Florence, whoever he was not a mindless beast. He was a calculating predator who studied his prey, planned his attacks, and escaped consequences for 17 years. Understanding this is essential to understanding why the case has proven so difficult to solve. Now, I want to address something directly. Throughout this narrative, I've presented the facts as they are known and the theories as they have been advanced. But I have my own thoughts, my own interpretations, born of the months I've spent studying this case. I believe the investigation failed not because the truth was unknowable, but because institutional interests repeatedly trumped the pursuit of justice. I believe evidence was mishandled, sometimes deliberately, to protect theories that had become politically untenable to abandon. I believe witnesses were pressured, suspects were scapegoated, and the genuine perpetrator or perpetrators benefited from the chaos. I believe the Sardinian trail was a distraction that consumed precious years while the true threat remained active. I believe the Pacciani prosecution, whatever Pacciani's actual involvement, was built on foundations too shaky to support the weight of justice. And I believe that the families of the victims deserve that resolution. They have waited long enough. They have suffered enough. They deserve to know. Let me take you back, one final time, to the Tuscan hills. Imagine driving through the countryside today, nearly 40 years after the last attack. The vineyards still cascade down the slopes. The cypress trees still stand sentinel along the roads. The villages still cluster around their ancient churches. Their piazzas still fill with life on warm evenings. But if you know the history, if you know what happened here, you see it differently. That clearing by the roadside, where lovers once parked to steal a moment of privacy, now carries a weight of memory. That stretch of forest, where campers once pitched their tents beneath the stars, now holds shadows that seem deeper than they should be. The monster's hunting grounds have been reclaimed by ordinary life. Couples no longer fear to seek privacy in the countryside, at least not for the reasons their parents and grandparents feared. The terror has faded into history, into documentation, into true crime documentaries and YouTube videos like this one. But the absence of fear does not mean the absence of truth. Somewhere, perhaps, the monster still lives. He would be elderly now if he survived, his hunting days long behind him. Does he watch the documentaries? Does he read the books? Does he feel satisfaction that his secrets have held for so long? Or does he feel the weight of what he did pressing down on him as his final years slip away? Or perhaps he is already gone, having taken his secrets to the grave. Perhaps the DNA on those bullets will match someone long buried, someone who escaped justice not through cunning, but simply by dying before the technology existed to expose him. Either way, the accounting is coming due. The victims cry out for recognition, the families demand answers, and the machinery of investigation, however rusty, however compromised, grinds forward still. I want to tell you about the broader significance of this case, because it extends far beyond the specific crimes committed. The monster of Florence represents a fundamental challenge to our belief in justice. We want to believe that society protects us, that law enforcement agencies will identify and apprehend those who do us harm, that the guilty will be punished and the innocent protected. This case shatters those comforting illusions. For 17 years, a predator operated with impunity in one of the most densely populated regions of Italy. Despite massive police resources, despite international attention, despite the efforts of countless investigators and prosecutors, he was never definitively caught. The convictions that were obtained have been challenged, overturned, or remain deeply controversial. The true perpetrator, whoever he was, may have died free, may still be alive and free, his identity known only to himself. What does this tell us about the limits of justice? What does it tell us about the systems we trust to keep us safe? I think it tells us that those systems are human and therefore fallible, that they can be compromised by incompetence, by corruption, by the simple difficulty of solving crimes committed in darkness by someone determined not to be caught. It tells us that justice is not inevitable, that some crimes do go unpunished, that some victims never receive the closure they deserve. But I think it also tells us something about persistence. The families have not given up. The investigators, even the flawed ones, have not stopped trying. The DNA evidence discovered in 2024 represents a breakthrough that was unimaginable when the crimes were committed. Technology advances. Techniques improve. What was impossible yesterday may be routine tomorrow. The monster of Florence may yet be identified. The truth may yet emerge. And even if the perpetrator himself is beyond earthly justice, the knowledge of his identity would bring some measure of peace to those who have waited so long. This case has influenced not just criminal investigation, but popular culture as well. Thomas Harris's attendance at the Pacciani trial directly informed his novel Hannibal, bringing the atmosphere of Florence and the shadow of the monster into one of literature's most famous fictional narratives. The connection between real horror and fictional horror, between the monster of Florence and Hannibal Lecter, speaks to how deeply these events penetrated the cultural consciousness. Countless books have been written about the case. Douglas Preston and Mario Spezzi's The Monster of Florence, published in 2008, brought international attention to the investigation and its failures. The book was controversial, leading to legal action against both authors, but it also ensured that the case would not be forgotten, would not fade into the obscurity that claims so many cold cases. The Netflix documentary series released in 2025 continues this tradition, introducing a new generation to the mystery. Each retelling brings fresh eyes, fresh perspectives, and fresh possibilities that someone, somewhere, might recognize a detail, might remember a conversation, might provide the missing piece that finally completes the puzzle. This is why stories like this matter. Not for entertainment, though I hope you have found this narrative compelling. Not for sensationalism, though the facts themselves are sensational enough. But because every retelling is an opportunity. Every viewer is a potential witness. Every share, every comment, every conversation sparked by this video might be the one that finally breaks the case open. So I ask you again, share this video. Tell others about the monster of Florence. Keep the names of the victims alive. Keep the pressure on investigators. Keep demanding answers. And if you know something, anything about these crimes, come forward. It is never too late to do the right thing. Let me speak now about the psychological profile of the individual or individuals responsible. Because understanding the mind behind these crimes is essential to understanding the crimes themselves. The FBI profile described a sexually inadequate male, and this assessment aligns with what we know about similar offenders. The targeting of couples engaged in intimate activity suggests someone who was unable to form normal romantic or physical relationships, someone for whom the sight of others enjoying what he could not have provoked, not jealousy in the ordinary sense, but a rage that demanded violent expression. The mutilations, focused on female sexual characteristics, suggest a profound disturbance in the perpetrator's relationship with women, with female sexuality, with the female body itself. Some analysts have theorized that the perpetrator may have experienced trauma or rejection related to women, perhaps a domineering mother, perhaps early romantic humiliation, perhaps something even darker in his formative years. The fact that male victims were not mutilated even when killed supports this interpretation. The violence against men was functional, necessary to eliminate resistance and witnesses. The violence against women was expressive, ritualistic, meaningful to the perpetrator in ways that transcended mere necessity. The timing of the attacks, on Saturday nights during new moons, suggests obsessive planning and perhaps obsessive-compulsive tendencies. The perpetrator was not impulsive. He was methodical. He waited for conditions to be perfect before striking. The 17-year span of the crimes, with gaps of varying length between attacks, suggests someone who could control his urges, who could wait months or even years between crimes if necessary. This level of control is relatively rare among serial offenders and indicates high intelligence and strong executive function. The complete absence of forensic evidence, at least until the recent DNA discoveries, suggests either extraordinary luck or extraordinary care. The perpetrator wore gloves, avoided leaving fingerprints, controlled his environment with remarkable precision. This speaks to someone who studied forensic techniques, who understood what investigators would look for, who took specific measures to frustrate their efforts. All of this paints a portrait of someone who would not have stood out. He would have seemed normal, perhaps even boring. He would have held a job, maintained a residence, interacted with neighbors and colleagues without raising suspicion. The monster hid in plain sight for nearly 2 decades, and he could only have done so by projecting an exterior of unremarkable normalcy. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of cases like this. The monster is not a creature from mythology, easily identified by horns or fangs or glowing eyes. The monster looks like anyone else. The monster could be your neighbor, your co-worker, the stranger who holds the door for you at the grocery store. The monster walks among us, indistinguishable from the innocent, and we have no way of knowing until it is too late. If you've made it this far into our journey, you are clearly someone who appreciates depth, who wants to understand rather than simply to be entertained. I want to invite you to join our community at the Midnight File. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and you'll be the first to know when we release our next investigation, because there are many more files to open, many more stories to tell, and I would be honored to have you with us. Now, let us approach the end of our narrative. But before I offer my closing reflection, I want to acknowledge something important. I have spent hours researching this case, reading the books, watching the documentaries, examining the evidence as it has been presented. And yet I am acutely aware that I am an outsider to this story. I did not grow up in Tuscany. I did not experience the terror that gripped the region during the monster's active years. I did not lose a loved one to his violence. The people who truly understand this case are the families of the victims, the investigators who devoted their careers to solving it, even when their efforts were frustrated at every turn, the journalists like Mario Spezzi, who risked their freedom to tell the truth, the prosecutors and judges who wrestled with evidence and testimony, trying to find justice in a labyrinth of contradiction. I honor their efforts, even when I critique their failures. This case has been marked by human error, but also by human persistence. People have refused to give up, refused to let the victims be forgotten, refused to accept that some mysteries can never be solved. That persistence matters. It is the only thing that keeps cases like this alive, that maintains the possibility of eventual justice. And it is why I tell these stories, why the Midnight File exists, why I ask you to subscribe and share and engage. Because stories are how we remember. Stories are how we ensure that the victims are not reduced to statistics. Stories are how we keep pressure on the systems that failed and demand that they do better. The monster of Florence wanted his victims to disappear, to be consumed by the darkness he created. But they have not disappeared. Their names are spoken. Their stories are told. Their memories persist. And somewhere, perhaps, the monster himself is listening. Wondering if his time is finally running out. Wondering if the DNA on those bullets will lead investigators to his door. Wondering if the truth he has guarded for so long is about to be exposed. Good. Let him wonder. Let him fear. Let him know that we have not forgotten. And now let me leave you with this. Florence, they call it the cradle of the Renaissance, a city of art and beauty, of Michelangelo and Botticelli, of the Duomo rising against the Tuscan sky. Millions of tourists walk its streets each year, marveling at the achievements of human creativity and ingenuity. But every city has its shadows. Every paradise has its serpent. And in the hills surrounding Florence, in the quiet clearings and moonless nights, a different kind of human capacity expressed itself. Not creativity, but destruction. Not beauty, but horror. Not the aspiration toward the divine, but the embrace of something far darker. 16 young people drove into those hills seeking love and found only oblivion. Their lives were cut short by someone who saw in their happiness not something to celebrate but something to destroy. And for nearly 4 decades, that someone has escaped accountability. But the files remain open. The DNA waits to be matched. The families continue their vigil. And storytellers like myself continue to speak the names of the dead to ensure they are not forgotten. To demand that justice, however delayed, eventually arrives. The monster of Florence is one of Europe's great unsolved mysteries. But mysteries, by their nature, contain the possibility of solution. What is unknown can become known. What is hidden can be revealed. What is dark can be illuminated. I believe that one day we will know the truth. I believe that the victims will receive the justice they deserve. I believe that the monster, whoever he was, will be exposed. And until that day, I will keep telling this story. Because some files should never be closed. Because some victims should never be forgotten. Because some darkness must be confronted again and again until the light finally breaks through. This has been The Midnight File. I am Julian Cross. And if stories like this stay with you, if they haunt your thoughts and invade your dreams, then subscribe. Because the next file might be darker still. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant. And remember, every town keeps a secret. Some just bury it deeper than others. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. The monster of Florence remains unknown, but the search continues, and perhaps one day soon, the truth will finally emerge from the shadows. Good night. Believe the conspiracy theories, from satanic cults to elite networks, whether true or not, provided convenient cover for more mundane failures of police work and prosecutorial integrity. But I also believe that the truth is still out there. The DNA evidence discovered in 2024 represents a genuine breakthrough, a thread that, if followed carefully, might finally unravel this tangled web. Modern forensic techniques have solved cases far older than this one. The possibility of resolution, however distant, remains real.